The invitation arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, inside a plain white envelope with no handwritten note or personal message. It was a formal invitation from my daughter Vanessa and her husband Daniel for a celebration dinner at their new home in Connecticut. At the bottom of the card, one sentence immediately caught my attention. Formal attire required. I stared at those words longer than I should have. After nearly 4 decades working construction, I owned exactly one old suit that barely fit anymore. My hands were rough, scarred, and permanently stained from years of hard labor. Those same hands had built homes, repaired roofs during storms, and worked endless overtime shifts to raise Vanessa after her mother left us when she was 10 years old. Back then, Vanessa used to be proud of me. She would tell her teachers I could fix anything. But somewhere along the way, that pride slowly disappeared. I lived alone in a small apartment above an auto repair shop in New Jersey. The radiator barely worked in winter, and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument downstairs. But it was affordable. Retirement was never realistic for someone like me. My knees hurt every morning. My back constantly reminded me of every brick I had ever carried, and yet I still worked. Part-time jobs, whenever possible, just to stay afloat. Vanessa, on the other hand, had built a completely different life for herself. She married into the Whitmore family, a wealthy and highly respected family that cared deeply about status, appearances, and social connections. Daniel's mother, Patricia Whitmore, was the kind of woman who could insult someone while smiling, politely the entire time. The first time we met, she asked what I did for a living, and after I told her I work construction, she gave me a slow nod and replied, "Well, honest labor is still important in society." The words sounded polite, but the tone underneath them was impossible to miss. Over the years, Vanessa slowly changed. At first, the changes were subtle. She stopped calling every Sunday like she used to in college. Then family visits became less frequent. Eventually, most of our conversations only happened when she needed help with something. I helped them move furniture into their first apartment, loaned them money before the wedding when costs became unexpectedly overwhelming, and even babysat their son when their nanny quit. Suddenly, I never complained because she was still my daughter, no matter how distant she became. Part of me kept hoping things would eventually return to normal. 3 days before the dinner party, I went shopping for a suit. The salesman immediately judged me the moment I walked into the store, wearing old work boots and a faded jacket. He kept directing me toward the cheapest racks in the corner, as if expensive clothing would somehow be wasted on someone like me. Eventually, I found a navy blue suit that fit reasonably. Well, although the price made my stomach tighten, still, I bought it because I didn't want Vanessa feeling embarrassed by me again. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, wearing the full suit and tie, barely recognizing the tired old man staring back at me. My hair had gone mostly gray, and the lines on my face looked deeper than ever. Yet beneath all that exhaustion, I still saw the father who once worked 16-hour shifts just so his daughter could attend a better school and have opportunities he never had. The night before the party, my phone buzzed with a text message from Vanessa. At first, I smiled, thinking maybe she simply wanted to check on me. Instead, the message read, "Please try not to talk too much about construction tomorrow. Daniel's business partners and their families will be there." I read the text several times in complete silence. It felt like someone had quietly reached into my chest and squeezed all the air out of my lungs. My entire life, construction work had fed her, clothed her, paid for her education, and protected her from poverty. Every painful shift, every missed holiday, and every sacrifice had been made for her future. Yet now she wanted me to hide that part of myself because it no longer matched the image she wanted to present to wealthy people. I sat alone in my apartment for nearly an hour, staring out the window into the dark parking lot below, seriously considering not attending the party at all. But despite everything, I already knew I would still go because some parents continue loving their children even when that love is no longer returned with the same respect. The Whitmore house looked more like a private resort than an actual home. Luxury cars filled both sides of the street, and warm golden lights glowed through massive windows overlooking the perfectly maintained lawn. As I stepped out of my old pickup truck, I immediately noticed how badly it stood out compared to the expensive European cars parked nearby. For a moment, I honestly considered getting back inside and driving away, but before I could, the front door opened and Vanessa walked outside. She looked elegant in a dark green evening dress, wearing expensive jewelry and carrying herself with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in that world. For a brief second, I saw the little girl she used to be, the child who once waited by the window every evening for me to come home from work. But the moment disappeared quickly when her eyes shifted toward my truck. Instead of greeting me warmly, she quietly asked, "You actually drove that here?" I looked back at the truck and simply answered, "It still runs." Vanessa forced a small smile before leaning closer and saying, "Next time, maybe park farther away. Daniel's clients are arriving." Hearing that before even receiving a proper hello felt like a warning that the evening ahead would not go well. Inside, the house was enormous. Marble floors reflected the chandelier lights above. Waiters carried trays of wine and appetizers through crowded rooms, and guests stood in small groups, discussing business deals, investments, and vacation homes. Every man wore a tailored designer suit, and every woman looked polished enough to belong in a magazine advertisement. The second I walked in, I could feel people briefly noticing me before quickly returning to their conversations. Vanessa introduced me to several guests, but every introduction sounded rushed and uncomfortable. "This is my father, Richard," she would say, before immediately moving the conversation elsewhere. She never once mentioned the sacrifices I made for her or the years I spent raising her alone. It felt less like she was proud to introduce me and more like she was trying to manage an awkward situation before anyone asked too many questions. A few minutes later, Patricia Whitmore approached, holding a glass of wine and wearing the same carefully controlled smile I remember from previous family gatherings. She looked me up and down before saying, "Richard, I almost didn't recognize you in a suit." I politely greeted her, but she continued speaking in that same smooth tone that always carried hidden judgment underneath it. She mentioned hearing that I was still working despite my age, and then added, "Some people are simply built for physical labor, I suppose." Before I could respond, she casually turned toward another guest and began another conversation as if I no longer existed. That became the pattern for most of the evening. Quiet insults disguised as harmless comments, polite smiles covering obvious disrespect. The more time passed, the more invisible I felt standing among wealthy strangers who clearly viewed me as someone from a completely different class of society. At one point, a younger man asked what kind of work I did. Before I could answer, Vanessa quickly interrupted the conversation herself. She laughed lightly and said, "My dad worked construction most of his life, but tonight we're trying not to bore everyone with work stories." Several guests laughed softly at the comment. I forced myself to smile, but internally something painful settled deeper into my chest. Construction work had paid for her education, kept food on the table, and protected her from growing up in poverty, yet she spoke about it like it was an embarrassing flaw that needed to be hidden from sophisticated company. Eventually, everyone gathered in the dining room for dinner. The table was massive, covered with expensive flowers, candles, and silverware arranged so carefully that I barely knew which utensils to touch first. I ended up seated near Patricia, while Daniel sat farther down beside several business associates. Most of the dinner conversation centered around money, politics, elite schools, and international travel. Every topic reminded me how different my life had been from theirs. Then one of Daniel's business partners smiled at me and casually asked, "Richard, how did you feel when Vanessa married into such a successful family?" The question itself was harmless, but before I could answer, Vanessa laughed softly while sipping her wine and replied, "Honestly, Dad was probably relieved someone finally rescued me from a life of cheap apartments and construction dust." The entire table laughed loudly. Even Patricia smiled, approvingly at the joke. I felt heat rising into my face, but it was no longer simple embarrassment. It was disappointment, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Vanessa continued talking without realizing the damage she was doing. She explained how sophistication had never really existed in our household, while Patricia added that Vanessa had adapted beautifully after entering their family. More laughter followed. Nobody at the table looked uncomfortable. Nobody defended me to them. Humiliating the old construction worker was harmless entertainment during an expensive dinner party. Then Vanessa said something that completely changed the atmosphere. For me, laughing again, she admitted, "When I was younger, I used to beg Dad not to come to school events wearing his dirty work clothes because it was honestly humiliating." The room exploded with laughter once more, but this time I did not pretend to smile. I simply sat there, quietly, staring at my daughter across the table, realizing that the child I spent my entire life protecting had become ashamed of the very man who gave her everything. The atmosphere at the table changed immediately after my words. The laughter that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that made every small movement noticeable. I could see Vanessa's expression shifting from confidence to discomfort as she realized the conversation was no longer something she could control or redirect. I remained seated, calm on the outside, but internally I was fully aware that years of silence were now collapsing into a single moment that could not be undone. Patricia Whitmore stopped smiling completely, and Daniel looked increasingly unsettled as he glanced between me and Vanessa, trying to understand how the narrative he believed in was starting to fall apart. I continued speaking, because stopping halfway would have meant nothing had changed. I explained how every major milestone in Vanessa's life had required financial and personal sacrifice from me, not as a complaint but as a statement of fact. I described the years of overtime work, the physical toll it took on my body, and the choices I made that consistently prioritize her future over my own stability. As I spoke, I noticed several guests shifting, uncomfortably, no longer participating in the earlier amusement. Vanessa attempted to interrupt once, but her voice lacked the authority it had earlier in the evening. It was clear that the version of events she had presented to others was now being directly challenged in front of the same audience she had been trying to impress. Daniel finally spoke again, this time more carefully, asking for clarification about financial contributions and wedding expenses. I answered each question directly without exaggeration or emotion, simply stating what had been done and when. The more I explained, the more visible the disconnect became between what Vanessa had told her new family and what had actually happened. Patricia Whitmore's composure began to weaken as she realized her earlier assumptions about me were no longer supported by the facts being presented. The confidence she had displayed earlier in the evening was replaced with a controlled silence that suggested reassessment rather than judgment. Vanessa eventually leaned back in her chair, avoiding eye contact entirely, and said the conversation was unnecessary and embarrassing. But at that point, the embarrassment she referred to was no longer directed at me. It was now directed at the inconsistencies in her own narrative. The dinner table, which had started as a display of wealth, status, and superiority, had turned into a quiet examination of truth. And for the first time since I arrived, I was no longer the one being evaluated by them. Vanessa's discomfort grew more visible as the silence stretched across the table, and the earlier confidence she had carried throughout the evening was now replaced by controlled irritation. She avoided looking directly at me, instead focusing on the table's setting, as if it could offer an escape from what had just been exposed. Daniel leaned slightly toward her, speaking in a low tone, but whatever he said did not change the tension already established in the room. Patricia Whitmore remained still, her expression now neutral but no longer dismissive, as though she was reconsidering every assumption she had made earlier about me and my role in Vanessa's life. I did not raise my voice or attempt to dominate the moment. I simply continued explaining, this time focusing on the timeline of events that had shaped Vanessa's upbringing and early adult life. I described the years where financial pressure defined every decision I made, including moments when basic personal needs were ignored in order to ensure tuition payments were made on time. I also clarified specific instances where I had been asked for support during emergencies, each of which I responded to without hesitation. As I spoke, the dynamic in the room shifted further. The guests who had previously laughed were now listening in silence, no longer treating the situation as entertainment, but as a direct contradiction of a narrative they had been given earlier. Vanessa finally interrupted again, this time more sharply, stating that bringing up the past in front of guests was inappropriate. However, the reaction in the room suggested that the issue was no longer about etiquette. It was about credibility. Daniel turned to her with a serious expression, asking directly why certain financial details had never been mentioned. The question itself changed the tone significantly because it was no longer directed at me, but at her. Vanessa hesitated before responding, offering vague explanations about misunderstandings and forgotten details, but her answers lacked clarity and consistency. Patricia Whitmore eventually spoke for the first time in a while, asking for confirmation on several points I had mentioned earlier. I answered each question without hesitation or emotional framing, simply stating facts. The more I confirmed, the more evident it became that the version of events Vanessa had presented to her new family did not align with reality. Patricia's posture changed slightly, no longer relaxed or dismissive, but attentive in a way that suggested reassessment of both the situation and Vanessa's credibility. By this point, the dinner had completely lost its original purpose. Conversations had stopped entirely, and even the background movement of staff felt subdued. Vanessa sat quietly, no longer attempting humor or deflection, while Daniel appeared increasingly unsettled by the widening gap between perception and truth. I remained seated, fully aware that the situation had moved beyond personal embarrassment and into something far more consequential, where reputation, trust, and narrative control were all being questioned simultaneously in front of the very people Vanessa had intended to impress. Vanessa finally broke the silence, but not in the way she had earlier in the evening. Her voice was lower now, controlled but strained. She insisted that the situation was being misunderstood and that emotions were distorting what had actually happened in the past. However, the certainty she usually carried was no longer present. Daniel turned fully toward her, asking direct questions about specific financial contributions I had mentioned, and for the first time she struggled to answer without contradiction. The room stayed completely quiet, with every guest now fully aware that the narrative they had been told no longer matched the facts being presented in real time. Patricia Whitmore leaned back slightly, observing both Vanessa and me without interruption. Her earlier confidence in how she viewed me had clearly shifted into evaluation rather than judgment. I did not raise my voice or attempt to dominate the conversation. I simply remained consistent with everything I had already said, confirming details when asked and correcting inaccuracies when necessary. The contrast between clarity and hesitation in the room became increasingly visible. What had started as a social dinner had turned into an uncomfortable exposure of gaps between appearance and reality. Vanessa attempted once more to regain control of the situation by suggesting that I was exaggerating past sacrifices for emotional impact. But this time, even her tone lacked strength. Daniel did not immediately defend her, which was significant in itself, as it showed he was no longer fully aligned with her version of events. Instead, he remained silent for several seconds, before asking for a private conversation after the dinner. That statement alone shifted the energy again, because it indicated that what had just been revealed would not remain confined to the table. I responded calmly, stating that I had not come to the dinner to create conflict, but to attend an invitation extended to me as her father. I made it clear that I had no intention of continuing arguments in front of guests, but I also would not allow my history to be misrepresented as a source of entertainment or social convenience. The guests remained silent, no longer reacting emotionally, but processing the implications of everything they had just heard. Vanessa eventually stopped speaking altogether. Her posture changed, no longer defensive or performative, but withdrawn. The earlier version of her that had controlled the tone of the evening no longer existed in that room. Patricia remained quiet. Daniel looked uncertain, and the guests avoided eye contact, sensing that they were witnessing a private family fracture that had become public. I stood up slowly, not dramatically, and adjusted my jacket before speaking. One final time in a calm, steady tone, I said I would not continue the conversation further and that I would leave them to their evening. Then I walked out of the dining room without waiting for a response, leaving behind a table that was no longer defined by wealth or status, but by unresolved truth and irreversible exposure.